For more than 2 centuries, school curricula, romantic paintings, and popular culture have repeated a single, stirring myth about the greatest political upheaval in modern European history. That in the sweltering summer of 1789, the starving, downtrodden peasantry and working-class citizens of Paris rose up in a spontaneous moral crusade against the extravagant absolutism of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, storming the medieval fortress of the Bastille to shatter the chains of feudal tyranny and demand liberty, equality, and fraternity. But this story is fundamentally incomplete, and historically, it is wrong. The French Revolution was not ignited by peasant-bred riots or Enlightenment philosophy. It was triggered, funded, and weaponized by international Swiss banking syndicates, Parisian bondholders, and the shadowy private tax cartel of the farmers' general fighting to enforce sovereign debt repayment and protect their immense fortunes from royal bankruptcy. Behind the romanticized imagery of Phrygian caps, tricolor cockades, and blood-stained guillotines lies a cold, intricate financial conspiracy of predatory state lending, fraudulent accounting, and sovereign debt speculation that mainstream political histories almost entirely ignore. The true architects of the old regime's collapse were not radical street orators or philosopher lawyers, but elite financiers and treasury ministers operating in the shadows of Versailles and the Geneva banking district. Jacques Necker, the billionaire Swiss private banker who fraudulently cooked the royal balance sheets to secure personal political power. Charles Alexander de Calonne, the desperate controller general who discovered France was mathematically insolvent. The 30 Immortals of Geneva, an elite banking syndicate that gambled on the life expectancies of young girls to extract tens of millions in sovereign annuities. And the 60 multimillionaire oligarchs of the Farmers General, who built a 24-kilometer customs wall around Paris to squeeze every last penny from the population. Their private financial struggles, a crippling one, 3 billion livre war debt from financing the American Revolution, an unpayable sovereign debt service consuming over half of national tax revenues, a panic among wealthy Parisian bondholders over a royal default in July 1789, and a disastrous experiment with hyperinflationary paper money, are the true mechanical forces that detonated the French Revolution. Most people assume the revolution began when the Parisian mob marched on the Bastille on July 14, 1789, or when the Estates General assembled at Versailles in May. But the true origin of the French monarchy's collapse starts nearly 2 decades earlier and hundreds of miles away, inside the private counting houses of Geneva in 1770. To understand why the head of Louis XVI fell into a wicker basket in the Place de la Révolution, one must first trace the catastrophic structural defect of French royal finance. A regime that possessed the wealth of an empire but lacked a central bank, forcing the crown into the predatory clutches of private international moneylenders. Throughout the 18th century, Great Britain and France were locked in a titanic, worldwide struggle for imperial dominance. Yet while the British Empire could finance its global wars by borrowing vast sums at modest interest rates of 3 to 4% through the Bank of England, a publicly backed institution created in 1694, whose debts were guaranteed by the British Parliament. The French monarchy had no central bank and no constitutional parliament to guarantee its debts. Because the memory of John Law's catastrophic Mississippi bubble in 1720 had left the French public deeply terrified of paper currency and national banks, the French crown was forced to borrow from an opaque network of private financiers, court bankers, and foreign Protestant syndicates in Geneva, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt, who demanded punishing interest rates of 8 to 10% to compensate for the risk of royal default. The structural fragility of French royal finance was aggravated by a deeply corrupt and regressive tax system. Under the archaic laws of the old regime, the 2 wealthiest estates of the realm, the Catholic Church, the First Estate, which owned over 10% of all French land and collected hundreds of millions in tithes, and the hereditary nobility, the Second Estate, which held vast landed estates, enjoyed near total exemption from direct taxation. The entire fiscal burden of funding the kingdom's military, navy, and royal court fell squarely upon the shoulders of the Third Estate. The unrepresented peasantry, urban artisans, merchants, and the rising bourgeoisie. To collect indirect taxes on essential commodities, the French crown did not employ civil servants. Instead, it leased the collection of national taxes to a private corporation of 60 multimillionaire financiers known as the Farmers General firm Général. Headquartered in a monumental mansion on the Rue Neuve des Petits Champs in Paris, the Farmers General paid the crown a fixed, guaranteed sum up front for a 6-year lease, and then deployed an armed private army of over 20,000 paramilitary guards gabless across France to ruthlessly extract taxes on salt, the hated gabelle, tobacco, wine, leather, and customs duties. The Farmers General pocketed the difference between the taxes they collected and the sum they paid the crown, accumulating staggering private fortunes while ordinary French citizens who attempted to sell untaxed salt were sentenced to the galleys or hanged. In 1784, to stop the smuggling of untaxed food, wine, and goods into the capital, the Farmers General commissioned the construction of the infamous Wall of the Farmers General, Mur des Fermiers Généraux *, a massive, 24-kilometer stone barrier 3 meters high, punctuated by 55 imposing neoclassical toll gates, barrières, designed by architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux. The wall literally imprisoned Paris in a private corporate tax trap, forcing every merchant and farmer entering the city to pay exorbitant tariffs on every loaf of bread, bottle of wine, and cart of firewood. The hated stone wall bred immense popular fury across the capital, giving rise to the famous Parisian epigram. The wall walling Paris makes Paris murmur. Le murmurant Paris rend Paris murmurant *. The economic catastrophe of the old regime was dramatically accelerated in 1786 by the signing of the Anglo-French Commercial Treaty, universally known as the Eden Agreement, negotiated between British diplomat William Eden and French officials. The treaty was hailed by French physiocratic economists as an enlightened step toward international free trade, lowering reciprocal import tariffs on British manufactured goods in exchange for reduced duties on French wine and brandy. However, French officials failed to anticipate the overwhelming industrial superiority of Great Britain's early industrial revolution. Powered by modern steam engines and mechanized spinning jennies, cheap, mass-produced British cotton textiles, woolens, and iron hardware flooded across the English Channel, instantly undercutting domestic French production. In textile manufacturing centers across Normandy, Champagne, and Lyon, hundreds of French textile workshops went bankrupt, throwing over 200,000 urban artisans and weavers into immediate unemployment precisely as catastrophic droughts and hailstorms destroyed the French agricultural harvest of 1788. Here is the first major historical reality that conventional textbooks almost never explain. The French monarchy was not brought down by the personal extravagances of Versailles, but by the financial cost of bankrolling the American Revolutionary War. Between 1776 and 1783, King Louis XVI, eager to avenge France's humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War, made the fateful decision to provide covert and overt military, naval, and financial backing to the American colonies against Great Britain. France dispatched 35,000 soldiers and sailors under Rochambeau and de Grasse, provided 90% of the gunpowder used by George Washington's Continental Army, and spent over 1.3 billion livres, equivalent to more than 3 years of total French national revenue, to finance American independence. To finance this astronomical war expenditure without provoking domestic tax revolts, King Louis XVI turned in October 1776 to a financial wizard from Geneva, Jacques Necker, a Swiss Protestant private banker who had amassed a personal fortune through grain speculation and trading British East India Company stock. Necker was appointed Director General of Royal Finance. Because Necker was a foreigner and a Protestant, French law barred him from sitting on the King's Royal Council or holding the official title of Comptroller General. To prove his indispensability to the crown, Necker promised to finance the American war entirely through borrowed money, without raising a single sou in taxes. Necker executed this promise by marketing an aggressive, unprecedented volume of sovereign life annuities *rents viagers, borrowing hundreds of millions of livres from international banking syndicates. To maximize their investment returns, elite private banking houses in Geneva, led by Mallet, Hench, Odier, and Ferrier, engineered one of the most sophisticated financial arbitrage schemes in European history. The syndicate of the 30 Immortals of Geneva, les 30 Immortals de Genève. The Swiss bankers recognized a critical flaw in French annuity law. The French Treasury allowed investors to purchase life annuities on the heads of third parties, paying an identical annual interest rate of 8 to 10% regardless of the age or health of the nominee. The Genevan syndicate carefully selected 30 healthy young girls between the ages of 4 and 7 from wealthy Swiss patrician families, had them inoculated against smallpox, and placed them under the care of top medical physicians. The Genevan banks then pooled millions of livres from European investors and purchased thousands of French royal annuity contracts tied exclusively to the lives of these 30 girls. Because these carefully sheltered Swiss girls lived into their 60s and 70s, the French treasury was legally bled dry, compelled to pay out millions of livres in compounded annual interest for more than 4 decades on capital that had long since been spent on gunpowder and warships. The collapse of public trust in the monarchy was further magnified in 1785 by the sensational financial and political scandal known as the affair of the diamond necklace, Affaire du Collier de la Reine. An aristocratic confidence trickster, Jean de Valois-Saint-Trémy, forged the Queen's signature to deceive Cardinal de Rohan into purchasing a breathtaking diamond necklace containing 647 flawless diamonds, valued at the astronomical sum of 1.6 million livres, equivalent to the annual budget of a major French province, from court jewelers Baumer and Bassange. While Queen Marie Antoinette was entirely innocent of the fraud and had never seen the necklace, the sensational public trial before the Parliament of Paris in 1786 transfixed the nation, cementing in the minds of the struggling French public the irreversible conviction that while the Treasury claimed it was broke and demanded new taxes on the poor, the royal court at Versailles was wallowing in corrupt, multi-million livre diamond transactions. In February 1781, facing growing criticism from aristocratic rivals at court who suspected that the monarchy was sinking into insolvency, Jacques Necker published the most explosive financial document of the 18th century, the Compte rendu au roi report to the king. It was the first time in French history that the royal budget had ever been made public. Over 100,000 copies were printed and sold within weeks, translated into every European language and read aloud in Parisian cafes, salons, and public squares. This brings us to the second profound historical reality that popular history ignores. Jacques Necker's famous 1781 budget report was a masterpiece of creative accounting and outright financial fraud. To portray himself as a financial genius and protect his political position, Necker deliberately excluded over 200 million livres in extraordinary war debts, hid military expenditures in secret accounts, and fabricated a fictitious annual budget surplus of 10.2 million livres. The Compte rendu deceived international bond markets, allowing the crown to borrow hundreds of millions more at inflated rates, while permanently implanting in the minds of the French public the dangerous, false belief that the royal finances were fundamentally sound, and that any subsequent financial distress was the result of court corruption rather than structural insolvency. When King Louis XVI dismissed Necker in May 1781 following court intrigues, subsequent ministers discovered the terrifying truth. The royal treasury was completely empty, and the state was swimming in unpayable debt. In November 1783, Charles Alexander de Calonne was appointed Comptroller General of Finance. Calonne initially attempted to restore public confidence through massive spending on public works and monuments, borrowing an additional 650 million livres between 1783 and 1786. But by August 1786, the financial reality could no longer be hidden. Debt service alone was consuming over 260 million livres per year, more than 50% of the kingdom's entire annual revenue, and the monarchy was facing an annual operating deficit of over 110 million livres. In February 1787, Calonne summoned the Assembly of Notables, a gathering of 144 prominent princes, dukes, archbishops, and magistrates, to Versailles, presenting a radical, sweeping reform package: the abolition of tax privileges, the introduction of a universal territorial land tax payable by nobility and clergy alike, the establishment of provincial representative assemblies, and the deregulation of the grain trade. But the aristocratic notables, relying on Necker's fraudulent 1780, one claim that the budget had been in surplus, accused Calonne of fabricating the deficit to steal their wealth, and furiously rejected the reforms. Calonne was dismissed in disgrace and replaced by his chief critic, Archbishop Etienne Charles de Loménie de Brienne. Yet when Brienne opened the treasury ledgers, he was horrified to discover that Calonne had understated the disaster. Brienne attempted to register modified tax decrees with the Parliament of Paris, the kingdom's supreme court of aristocratic judges, but the Parliament refused, asserting that only the Estates General, the ancient representative body of the three orders that had not met since 1614, possessed the constitutional authority to grant new taxes. The desperate efforts of the French crown to stave off default in the late 1780s relied upon secret, emergency cash injections from the closest entity France possessed to a central bank, the case Descompte Discount Bank. Founded in 1776 by the reformist Controller General Robert Jacques Turgot, and managed by a tight-knit syndicate of Parisian and Swiss Protestant private bankers, led by Swiss financier Jean-Frédéric Perregaux, the Caisse d'Escompte was chartered to discount commercial bills of exchange. However, between 1787 and 1788, as the royal deficit exploded, the Treasury secretly compelled the bank to advance over 100 million livres in short-term credit to pay royal soldiers and state bond interest. When word leaked to the financial markets that the bank's vaults were empty and that its commercial reserves had been siphoned off to finance royal debts, frantic depositors rushed to the Rue Vivienne in August 1788 to demand physical gold and silver, forcing the crown to issue emergency decrees suspending the bank's cash payments. On August 8, 1788, facing total sovereign bankruptcy, an empty treasury, and a nationwide tax strike led by the parliaments, King Louis XVI was forced to capitulate. He suspended all debt payments, recalled Jacques Necker as principal minister of state to calm the panicked financial markets, and issued an official royal decree summoning the Estates General to convene at Versailles on May 1, 1789. When the 1,200 deputies of the Estates General arrived at Versailles in May 1789, the Assembly immediately deadlocked over the fundamental procedural question of voting, whether the three estates would meet and vote separately by order, giving the privileged nobility and clergy a permanent 2-to-1 veto, or whether they would meet together in a single chamber and vote by head. On June 17, 1789, led by the charismatic Abbé Sieyès and Count Murraybaugh, the deputies of the Third Estate, representing 98% of the French population, took a revolutionary historic step. They declared themselves the National Assembly. 3 days later, on June 20, finding their meeting hall locked by royal guards, the deputies gathered in an indoor royal tennis court and swore the famous tennis court oath, pledging never to separate until they had established a written constitution for France. As political tensions reached boiling point in early July 1789, conservative aristocrats around King Louis XVI, led by his younger brother the Count of Artois and the Queen's faction, persuaded the king to launch a military coup d'etat to crush the National Assembly. Over 30,000 royal troops, including foreign Swiss and German mercenary regiments, were ordered to encircle Paris and Versailles. On the afternoon of Saturday, July 11, 1789, Louis XVI dismissed Jacques Necker and ordered him to leave the kingdom immediately in secret. The news of Necker's dismissal reached Paris on Sunday morning, July 12, detonating an immediate financial and political explosion across the capital. To the wealthy Parisian bourgeoisie, the merchant bankers of the Bourse, and the hundreds of thousands of middle-class citizens who held government bonds, Necker was the only guarantor of sovereign debt repayment. His dismissal was interpreted not merely as a political crackdown, but as an immediate declaration of royal bankruptcy and total debt repudiation. This reveals the third critical financial reality of the French Revolution. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, was directly financed, armed, and coordinated by wealthy Parisian financiers and bondholders desperate to prevent royal debt default. On the morning of July 12, the Paris Bourse took the extraordinary step of closing its doors in protest. The financial epicenter of the insurrection was the Palais-Royal, the private, tax-exempt estate of the king's multimillionaire cousin, the Duke of Orleans, Philippe Égalité, who funded revolutionary agitators, rented out cafes to radical clubs, and supplied cash to pay deserting soldiers of the French Guards Gardes Françaises. Between July 12 and 13, the first targets destroyed by the angry Parisian crowds were not royal castles, but 40 of the hated toll gates and customs offices of the farmers general along the Paris wall, burning the tax registers and smashing the collection booths. The physical and commercial epicenter of the revolutionary conspiracy was the Palais-Royal, the private, tax-exempt sanctuary of the king's immensely wealthy cousin, Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans, who would later adopt the revolutionary name Philippe Égalité. In 1781, facing personal financial difficulties despite owning vast landed estates, the Duke embarked on a radical commercial real estate development. He enclosed the gardens of his palace with grand neoclassical arcades, leasing dozens of storefronts to cafes, bookstores, print shops, gambling dens, and political clubs. Under French law, the Palais-Royal was a private princely property into which the king's municipal police and royal guards were strictly forbidden to enter without the duke's express permission. The palace transformed into an extraordinary sovereign libertarian enclave where radical journalists, pamphleteers, and agitators operated with total legal immunity, funded by the duke's private treasury and printing presses, serving as the staging ground from which Camille Desmoulins leapt upon a café table on July 12, 1789, to call the citizens of Paris to armed insurrection. On the morning of Tuesday, July 14, 1789, the armed Parisian crowds, joined by defecting soldiers of the French Guards with field cannons, marched first to the Hôtel des Invalides, seizing 30,000 muskets and 12 artillery pieces. They then marched on the fortress of the Bastille. The crowd did not attack the medieval fortress to liberate political prisoners. There were only 7 prisoners inside, including 4 forgers and 2 lunatics. They attacked it to seize 250 barrels of gunpowder stored in its cellars to defend their newly formed bourgeois National Guard against the king's mercenary regiments. The fall of the Bastille broke the king's military resolve, forced Louis XVI to recall Necker, and permanently transferred sovereign authority from the crown to the National Assembly. Yet the National Assembly, having inherited the monarchy's crushing mountain of sovereign debt, faced the exact same fiscal crisis that had destroyed the old regime. The Treasury was empty, tax collection had completely collapsed, and international bankers refused to extend new credit. On November 2, 1789, the National Assembly adopted a radical, sweeping solution proposed by Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the aristocratic Bishop of Autun: the nationalization and confiscation of all lands and properties owned by the Catholic Church in France, valued at over 3 billion livres. To monetize this vast real estate windfall, the National Assembly issued transferable, interest-bearing sovereign bond certificates known as assignats, intended to be redeemed exclusively through the purchase of confiscated church lands, biens nationaux. But facing desperate, uncontrollable budget deficits, the revolutionary government made the fatal mistake of transforming assignats into unbacked paper legal tender in April 1790, turning on the printing presses to finance government spending. Between 1790 and 1796, the revolutionary government printed over 45 billion livres in assignats, completely flooding the economy with unbacked paper currency. The hyperinflation of the assignats between 1790 and 1795 demonstrated the classic economic principle of Gresham's law in its most brutal and destructive form. Bad paper money completely drove good metallic currency out of circulation. As the revolutionary printing presses in Paris churned out billions of paper assignats day and night, French citizens and merchants immediately hoarded every silver écu and gold louis d'or coin, burying metallic wealth in gardens, floorboards, and stone walls. In the marketplaces, the value of the paper currency collapsed at a terrifying rate. An assignat with a face value of 100 livres was worth 80 livres in silver in 1791, 50 livres in 1792, 8 livres in 1794, and less than 30 sous by late 1795. A simple pair of leather boots that cost 20 livres in 1790 cost over 4,000 paper livres by 1795, destroying the life savings of the middle class and turning daily shopping in Paris into a desperate nightmare of carrying bundles of worthless paper in wicker baskets. The result was a catastrophic hyperinflationary collapse that destroyed the French currency. By 1793, the purchasing power of the assignat had plummeted by over 90%. Farmers in the countryside refused to accept worthless paper money for their grain, food supplies vanished from Parisian markets, and urban workers rioted over soaring bread prices. To enforce the value of the paper currency and prevent total economic collapse, the radical Jacobin regime under Maximilien Robespierre enacted the draconian law of the maximum in September 1793, imposing strict price ceilings on basic food items and declaring the death penalty for merchants who hoarded grain or refused to accept assignats at face value. The economic chaos fueled the paranoid terror that sent thousands to the guillotine, including 28 former members of the Farmers General, among them the greatest chemist of the 18th century, Antoine Lavoisier, who were executed on a single morning on May 8, 1794. The final, definitive bankruptcy of the French revolutionary state was formalized on September 30, 1797, under the government of the Directory, in an event known to economic history as the two-thirds bankruptcy, banqueroute des deux tiers. Confronted with a completely collapsed currency, a mountain of unpaid sovereign debt exceeding 4 billion livres, and an empty national treasury. Finance Minister Dominique Vincent Raymond Nogaret introduced a brutal, draconian decree. The French government unilaterally repudiated, wiped out, and canceled two-thirds of the entire national debt. The remaining one-third of the debt was converted into new government bond certificates known as asterisk tiers consolidé asterisk, which immediately lost 80% of their face value in open trading. The two-thirds bankruptcy destroyed the wealth of over 200,000 middle-class French bondholders and retired rentiers who had survived the reign of terror, proving that neither absolute monarchy nor revolutionary democracy could escape the unyielding arithmetic of sovereign debt insolvency, and setting the economic stage for the military coup d'etat of Napoleon Bonaparte in November 1799, and the subsequent founding of the Bank of France in 1800. The ultimate resolution of France's century-long monetary and fiscal crisis was achieved not by revolutionary assemblies or radical Jacobin committees, but by the authoritarian consolidation of General Napoleon Bonaparte. Seizing power in the coup d'etat of 18 Brumaire in November 1799, Napoleon immediately recognized that the French monarchy had fallen in 1789 and that the Republic had descended into chaos, because France lacked a disciplined, independent central banking institution comparable to the Bank of England. In January 1800, Napoleon partnered with the elite private bankers of Paris, led by Swiss financier Jean-Frédéric Perregaux, to establish the Bank of France Banque de France. In March 1803, Napoleon promulgated the historic monetary reform, establishing the franc-germinal asterisk, a rock-solid, bimetallic currency pegged strictly to 5 grams of fine silver and 290 milligrams of fine gold, with 0 unbacked paper assignats, which restored international credit, funded the French state, and provided France with the most stable monetary foundation in continental Europe for more than a century. The structural patterns that brought about the catastrophic financial collapse of the French Old Regime in 1789 bear an alarming, unmistakable parallel to the sovereign fiscal dynamics of the 21st century. Today, major developed democracies are accumulating historic sovereign debt burdens exceeding 100% of their annual gross domestic product, relying on creative central bank balance sheet monetization, concealed off-budget liabilities, and prolonged periods of suppressed interest rates to postpone fiscal reckoning. Just as in pre-revolutionary France, when sovereign debt service begins to consume alarming percentages of national tax revenues, governments find themselves trapped between raising crushing taxes on the productive middle class or engineering catastrophic currency devaluation. When international creditors and bondholders finally lose faith in sovereign balance sheets, the resulting fiscal shock inevitably shatters social cohesion, fueling political polarization, populist revolts, and systemic institutional instability. Behind the complex ledger entries of royal annuities, tax farming leases, and hyperinflationary currency depreciation lies a profound, heartbreaking human cost that shattered an entire generation. In the freezing winter of 1788 and 1789, as the sovereign debt crisis paralyzed the state, poor Parisian mothers stood for 6 hours in sub-zero blizzards outside padlocked bakeries, fighting desperately for a single loaf of blackened rye bread that cost 4/5 of a laborer's daily wage. In the rural provinces of the Vendée and Brittany, the economic disruptions of church land confiscations and mandatory military drafts sparked a brutal civil war in which over 200,000 peasant men, women, and children were slaughtered in scorched-earth military pacifications. In the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine's blade fell ceaselessly on aristocrats, bankers, shopkeepers, and peasant women alike, proving that when the financial machinery of a nation collapses into insolvency, the ultimate price is paid not in gold livres, but in human blood. The ultimate philosophical lesson of the French Revolution is that sovereign states are never destroyed primarily by military enemies or philosophical ideas. They are destroyed from within by broken balance sheets, unpayable debts, and elite institutional corruption that institutionalizes fiscal privilege while shifting the burdens of state onto the working classes, until the entire social contract collapses under its own mathematical impossibility. So when popular history tells you that the French Revolution was a spontaneous, romantic crusade born on July 14, 1789, when peasant crowds stormed the Bastille to demand liberty from a tyrant, remember the deeper, documented truth. The Bastille fell not because of a sudden passion for freedom, but because international Swiss banking cartels, tax-farming oligarchs, and panicked Parisian bondholders had spent 2 decades engineering a sovereign debt trap that mathematically bankrupted the French crown. If you rely on this channel for deep, documented investigations into the hidden financial ledgers and banking secrets that truly shape world history, subscribe to Chrono Dominion. Hit the like button to help this documentary reach more thoughtful viewers, and let me know in the comments below. Do you believe modern sovereign debt levels are pushing modern democracies toward a similar financial reckoning? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.